Isabel Allende, House of the Spirits, Part 6. His gesture would have been unpleasant if his eyes had not been so astonishingly sweet and bright. His tense posture would have suited a short, stubby man who wanted to appear taller, but he himself was almost 6 feet tall and slender. All the lines of his body were vertical and swept upward from his sharp aquiline nose and pointed eyebrows to his high forehead, which was crowned with the lion's mane of hair that he combed straight back. He was big-boned, with thick, spatulate fingers. He walked with a long stride and moved with energy. He appeared to be very strong, although there was no lack of grace to his movements. He had a very agreeable face, despite his severe, somber demeanor and his frequently sour expressions. His most salient trait was his moodiness and a tendency to grow violent and lose his head, a characteristic he had since childhood, when he used to throw himself on the floor, foaming at the mouth, so furious that he could scarcely breathe, and kicking like one possessed by the devil. He had to be plunged into freezing water to regain his control. Later on he learned to manage these fits, but he was left with a short temper which needed very little provocation to blossom into terrible attacks. "I am not returning to the mine," he said. It was the first sentence he had exchanged at the table with his sister. He had made his mind up the night before, when he realized that it was senseless to continue leading a hermit's life while seeking for a quick fortune. He still had 2 years left on the concession to the mine, enough time to finish exploring the marvelous lode he had discovered, but he felt that even if the foreman robbed him a little or did not know how to work it as well as he himself might, that was no reason for him to bury himself alive in the desert. He had no wish to become rich by such a sacrifice. He had his whole life ahead of him to make money if he could, time enough to be bored and to wait death without Rosa. "You'll have to work at something, Esteban," Firula replied. "It's true, we spent almost nothing, but Mama's medicines are expensive." Esteban looked at his sister. She was a beautiful woman, with rich curves and the oval face of a Roman Madonna, but already the ugliness of resignation could be glimpsed through her pale, peach-toned skin and her eyes full of shadows. Firula had accepted the role of her mother's nurse. She slept in the room that adjoined her mother's, ready at any moment to run in and administer her potions, hold her bedpan, or straighten her pillows. She was a tormented soul. She took pleasure in humiliation and in menial tasks, and since she believed that she would get to heaven by suffering terrible injustice, she was content to clean her mother's ulcerated legs, washing her and sinking deeply into her stench and wretchedness, even peering into her bedpan. And much as she hated herself for these torturous and unconfessable pleasures, she hated her mother more for being their instrument. She waited on her without complaint, but she managed subtly to extract from her the price of invalidism. Without anything being said openly, the fact remained that her daughter had sacrificed her life to care for the mother, and that she had become a spinster for that reason. Firula has turned down 2 suitors on the pretext of her mother's illness. She never spoke of it, but everyone knew about it. She moved thickly and awkwardly and had that same sour character as her brother, but life and the fact that she was a woman had forced her to overcome it and to clamp down on the bit. She seemed so perfect the word had spread that she was a saint. She was cited as an example because of the devotion that she lavished on Doña Esther, and because of the way she had raised her only brother, when her mother became ill and their father died, leaving them to dire poverty. Ferrula had adored her brother Esteban when he was a child. She slept with him, bathed him, took him out for strolls, did other people's sewing from dawn to dusk to pay for his schooling, and wept with rage and helplessness the day Esteban took a job in a notary's office because they could not make ends meet with what she earned. She had taken care of him and waited on him as she now did her mother, and she had woven him into her invisible net of guilt and unrepayable debts of gratitude. The boy began to move away from her the day he first put on his long pants. Esteban could recall the exact moment when he had realized that his sister was an ominous shadow in his life. It was when he had received his first wages. He had decided to save 50 centavos to fulfill a dream he had cherished ever since he was a child, to have a cup of Viennese coffee. Through the windows of the Hotel Français, he had seen the waiters pass by and trays held high above their heads on which lay these treasures, tall glass goblets crowned with towers of whipped cream and adorned with beautiful glazed maraschino cherries. The day of the first paycheck, he had crossed back and forth outside the establishment before getting up the courage to go through the door. Finally, barrette in hand, he had stepped timidly across the threshold and entered the luxurious dining room with its teardrop chandeliers and stylish furniture. Convinced that everyone was staring at him, that their 1,000 eyes found his suit too tight and his shoes old, he sat down on the edge of the chair, his ears burning, and gave his order to the waiter with a mere thread of a voice. He waited impatiently, watching people come and go in the tall mirrors, tasting with anticipation that pleasure that he had so often dreamed of. His Viennese coffee arrived, far more impressive than he had imagined, superb, delicious, and accompanied by 3 honey biscuits. He stared at it in fascination for a long time, until he finally dared to pick up the long-handled spoon. With a sigh of ecstasy, plunged it into the cream. His mouth was watering. He wanted to make this moment last as long as possible, to stretch it all the way to infinity. He began to stir the spoon, observing the way the dark liquid of the cup slowly moved into the cream. He stirred and stirred and stirred, and suddenly the tip of the spoon knocked against the glass, opening a crack through which the coffee leapt, pouring onto his clothes. Horrified, Esteban watched the entire contents of the goblet spill onto his only suit before the amused glances of the occupants of the adjoining tables. Pale with frustration, he stood up and walked out of the Hotel Français, 50 centavos poorer, leaving a trail of Viennese coffee on the springy carpet. When he reached his house, he was soaked and furious beside himself. When Furula found out what had happened, she told him acidly, "That's what you get for spending Mama's medicine money on your private little whims. God punished you." At that moment, Esteban saw clearly the ways his sister used to keep him down and how she managed to make him feel guilty. He understood that he would have to escape. As he made moves to get out from under her tutelage, Furula began to dislike him. His freedom to come and go stung her like a reproach, like an injustice. When he fell in love with Rosa and Furula saw how desperate he was, like a little boy begging for her help, needing her, following her around the house, pleading with her to intercede on his behalf with the Del Valle family, that she speak to Rosa, that she bribe Nana, she again felt important to her brother. For a time they seemed to have reconciled. But that rapprochement did not last long, and Furula was quick to realize that she had been used. She was happy when she saw her brother leave for the mine. From that time he had begun to work when he was 15. Esteban had supported the household, and had promised always to do so, but for Furula that had not been enough. It bothered her to have to stay locked up within these walls that stank of medicine and age, to be kept awake at night by the moans of her sick mother, always attentive to the clock so as to administer each dose at the proper time, bored, tired, and unhappy, while her brother had no taste of such obligations. Before him lay a destiny that was bright, free, and full of promise. He could marry, have children, know what love was. The day she sent the telegram telling him of Rose's death, she had felt a strange shiver, almost a joy. "You'll have to work at something," Fionnuala repeated. "You'll never lack for anything so long as you live," he said. "That's easy to say," Fionnuala replied, drawing a fishbone from between her teeth. "I think I'm going to go to the country, maybe to Tres Marias." "That place is in ruins, Esteban. I've always told you that the best thing you could do with it is sell it, but you're as stubborn as a mule. Land is something one should never sell. It's the only thing that's left when everything else is gone." "I don't agree. Land is a romantic idea. What makes a man rich is a good eye for business," Fionnuala insisted. "But you always said that one day you would go live in the country." "That day has arrived. I hate the city." "Why don't you say it's because you hate this house?" "That too," he answered brutally. "I would like to have been born a man so I could leave too," she said, full of hatred. "And I would not have liked to be a woman," he said. They finished eating in silence. The brother and sister had drifted apart, and the only thing that remained to unite them was the presence of their mother and the vague memory of the love they had for each other as children. They had grown up in a ruined home, witness to the moral and economic deterioration of their father and then the slow illness of their mother. Doña Esther had begun to suffer from arthritis at an early age, becoming stiffer and stiffer until she could only move with the greatest difficulty, like a living corpse. Finally, no longer able to bend her knees, she had settled for good into her wheelchair, her widowhood, and her despair. Esteban remembered her childhood and adolescence, his tight-fitting suits, the rope of St. Francis he was forced to tie around his waist as a sign of who only knew what vows his mother or his sister had made, his carefully mended shirts, and his loneliness. Fionnuala, 5 years his senior, washed and starched his only 2 shirts every other day so that he would always look fresh and properly dressed, and reminded him that on their mother's side they were heir to the noblest and most high-born surname of the Viceroyalty of Lima. Trueba had simply been a regrettable accident in the life of Doña Esther, who was destined to marry someone of her own class, but she had fallen hopelessly in love with that good-for-nothing immigrant, a first-generation settler, who within a few short years had squandered first her dowry and then her inheritance. But his blue blood past was of no use to Esteban if there was not enough money in the house to pay the grocer, and he had to go to school on foot because he did not have the fare for the streetcar. He recalled how they had packed him off to school with his chest and back lined with newspaper because he had no woolen underclothes and his overcoat was in tatters, and how he had suffered at the thought that his schoolmates might be able to hear, as he could, the crunch of the paper as it moved across his skin. In winter, the only source of heat in the whole house was the brazier in his mother's bedroom, where the 3 of them huddled together to save on candles and coal. His had been a childhood of privations, discomfort, harshness, interminable nighttime rosaries, fear, and guilt. All that remained of those days was his fury and his outsized pride. 2 days later, Esteban Trueba left for the country. Fionnuala accompanied him to the train station. She kissed him a cold goodbye on the cheek and waited for him to board the train, carrying his 2 leather suitcases with the bronze locks, the same ones he had bought when he left for the mine, and that were supposed to last him the rest of his life, according to the sailman's promise. She told him to be sure to take care of himself and to try to visit them from time to time. She said she would miss him, but they both knew they were destined not to see each other for many years, and underneath it all, they were both rather relieved. "Let me know if Mother takes a turn for the worse," Esteban shouted through the window as the train pulled out. "Don't worry," Ferrula replied, waving her handkerchief from the platform. Esteban Ferrula leaned back in the red velvet seat and felt deep gratitude to the British, who had the foresight to build first-class cars in which one could travel like a gentleman without having to put up with chickens, baskets, string-tied bundles, and the howls of other people's children. He congratulated himself for having decided on the more expensive ticket for the first time in his life, and observed that this was one of the details that marked the difference between a yokel and a gentleman. He decided that from that day on, no matter how tight his circumstances, he would always pay for the small comforts that made him feel rich. "I don't plan to be poor ever again," he decided, dreaming of the seam of gold. Through the window of the train, he watched the passing landscape of the Central Valley. Vast fields stretched from the foot of the mountain range, a fertile countryside filled with vineyards, wheat fields, alfalfa, and marigolds. He compared it with the sterile plateaus of the north, where he had spent years stuck in a hole in the midst of a rough and lunar horizon whose terrifying beauty never ceased to interest him. He had been fascinated by the colors of the desert, the blues, the purples, the yellows of the minerals lying on the surface of the earth. "My life is changing," he said softly. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. He got off the train at the station of San Lucas. It was a wretched place. At that hour of the morning, there was not a soul on the wooden platform, its roof eaten away by inclement weather and ants. From where he stood, he could see the whole valley through the impalpable mist that rose from the earth the night rain had soaked. The distant mountains disappeared behind the clouds of a shrouded sky. Only the snowy peak of the volcano could be seen in all its clarity, outlined against the landscape and lit by a timid winter sun. He looked around him. In his childhood, during the only happy time he could recall, before his father slid utterly into ruin and abandoned himself to alcohol and disgrace, the two of them had gone horseback riding in this part of the country. He remembered that he played during the summers at Tres Marias, but it was all so long ago that memory had almost erased it, and he did not recognize the place. He combed the landscape for the town of San Lucas, but was only able to make out a far-off hamlet that was faded into the dampness of the morning. He walked around the station. There was a padlock on the door to the office. There was a penciled note tacked on it, but it was so smudged that he could not read it. He heard the train pull out behind him, leaving a column of white smoke. He was alone in the silent landscape. He picked up his bags and stepped out into the mud and stones of a path that led into the town. He walked for more than 10 minutes, grateful that it was not raining, because it was only with great difficulty that he managed to advance along the path with his heavy suitcases, and he realized that the rain had rapidly converted it into an impassable mud hole. As he neared the hamlet, he saw smoke in several of the chimneys and breathed a sigh of relief, for it was so lonely and decayed he had feared it was a ghost town. He stopped at the edge of town and saw no one. Silence reigned on the only street, which was lined with modest adobe houses, and he felt as if he were walking in his sleep. He approached the nearest house, which had no windows, and the door was open. Leaving his bags on the sidewalk, he stepped inside, calling out in a loud voice. It was dark inside, because the only source of light was the door, and it took his eyes several seconds to adjust. Then he was able to make out two children playing on the hard earth floor, staring at him with great astonished eyes, and beyond them, in a courtyard, a woman walking toward him, wiping her hands on the edge of her apron. When she saw him, she made an instinctive motion to arrange a lock of hair that had fallen over her head. He greeted her, and she replied, covering her mouth with her fingers as she spoke to hide her toothless gums. Treba explained that he needed to rent a cart, but she appeared not to understand him, and only stood there, hiding the children in her apron, with a vacant expression. He walked out of the door, picked up his bags, and set out on his way again. When he walked nearly around the entire town without seeing anyone and was just beginning to grow desperate, he heard the hooves of a horse behind him. It was a rickety cart driven by a woodcutter. Treba stood in front of it, forcing the driver to stop. "Can you drive me to Tres Marias? I'll pay you handsomely," he shouted. "What takes you there?" the man replied. That place is just a lawless heap of rocks and no man's land." But he agreed to take him and helped him arrange his suitcases among the bundles of wood. Treba sat down beside him on the coachman's seat. Here and there, children darted out of the doorways as they heard the wagon pass. Treba felt lonelier than ever. About 5 miles outside the town of San Lucas, along a ruined path overgrown with weeds and full of potholes, there was a wooden sign with the name of the property. It hung from a broken chain, and the wind knocked it against the post with a muffled sound that made it echo like a funeral drum. A single glance was enough to make him understand that it would take a Hercules to rescue the place from desolation. The weeds had swallowed up the path, and wherever he looked, all he saw there was rocks, thick underbrush, and mountains. There was not even a suggestion of pasture or of the vineyards he remembered, and no one came out to greet him. The cart moved slowly, following the tracks from the passage of men and beasts had carved into the mass of weeds. After a moment, he was able to make out the main house, which was still standing, and although it looked like something from a nightmare, full of rubble with chicken wire and garbage strewn across the floor, half the tiles on the roof were broken, and a wild tangle of vines had grown through the windows and covered most of the outside wall. Around the house stood several windowless adobe huts. They had not been whitewashed and were black with soot. 2 dogs were fighting ferociously in the courtyard. The rattle of the cart wheels and the woodcutter's curses roused the inhabitants of the huts, who gradually emerged from their doorways. They stared at the new arrivals with amazement and mistrust. It had been 15 years since they had seen an owner, and they had simply assumed that there was no longer one. They could not have recognized in this tall, imperious man the little boy with chestnut curls who had played in his same courtyard many years before. Esteban stared back at them and likewise remembered no one. They were a sorry lot. He saw various women of indecipherable age, their skin dry and cracked, some apparently pregnant, all of them barefoot and dressed in faded rags. He calculated that there must be at least a dozen children of all sizes and ages. The youngest ones were naked. Other faces appeared from the doorways, too timid to come out. A few children scampered to hide behind the women. Esteban stepped down from the cart, unloaded his 2 bags, and pressed a few coins into the woodcutter's hands. "I'll wait for you if you like, patron," the man said. "This is as far as I'm going." He walked up to the house, gave the door a single forceful push, and went in. There was enough light inside because morning entered through the broken shutters and the chinks in the ceiling where the tiles had fallen through.